Over the last 4 days, I've extensively tested the new Series 8 Apple Watch for its sports and health tracking performance. In this video, we will take a comprehensive look at the heart rate accuracy, sleep tracking performance, GPS tracking, oxygen saturation measurements, and step counting accuracy of this brand new watch from Apple. I will also make a few quick remarks about the new temperature sensor that Apple added. Hello everyone! For those of you that are new to the channel, my name is Rob and I'm a postdoctoral scientist specializing in biological data analysis. As I mentioned in my first video, I think there are plenty of resources out there from which you can get the specs of this new Series 8 Apple Watch, like Apple's website for instance. So in this video, I will focus on independent performance testing of this new Apple Watch. So without further ado, let's get to the test results. And I want to start off with the heart rate tracking results. I showed you an initial test in the last video in which I did 5 training sessions, but I now more than tripled that data, which means I tested the Apple Watch Series 8 during a total of 16 training sessions. To test that, I'll compare the heart rate measurements of the Apple Watch Series 8 against the Polar H10 ECG chest strap, which can generally record my heart rate very accurately, as I showed you in a recent video. We'll start by looking at one of the easiest types of exercises for a watch to track, cycling indoors, and I'll be looking at a total of 3 interval spinning sessions. Now this involves very little movement or tension on my arms and will therefore produce less noise. And here we can see an overview of the accuracy over all of the rides. Each dot here is a single heart rate measurement, with along the horizontal axis the value according to the Polar H10 ECG chest strap, and on the vertical axis the value according to the Watch 8. Now the closer the points are to this blue line, the better the agreement, and the darker black the color, the more dots there are. As you can see, there's a really good agreement between the Watch 8 and the ECG chest strap, as basically all points are super close to the blue line. The correlation, this R value up here, is also really good at a rounded value of 1.00 when we allow for 2 decimal points. This correlation cannot be higher than 1, so a rounded value of 1.00 is more or less perfect. We can see why that is if we actually look at the individual training sessions. And here you can see my first interval spinning session, for instance. Along the horizontal axis we have the time and my heart rate is along the vertical axis. In blue-green I plotted my heart rate according to the Polar H10 ECG chest strap, and in red is my heart rate according to the Watch 8. As you can see, the 2 lines overlap very well to the point where you can basically not see the red line at all. So that means there's a good agreement. And this is basically what we see for all of the spinning sessions. The Apple Watch 8 does not show any significant deviation from the reference device in any of my testing so far. So this is looking really good. However, let's put this into perspective by comparing it to roughly 60 other watches I've tested over the last 2 years. That overview is displayed right here. The correlation value I was talking about before is the metric I will use for this, which is displayed along the horizontal axis right here. We want that value to be as close to 1 as possible. On the vertical axis, I ordered the watches from worst to best. So the further to the right and the higher a device is, the better is its correlation with the reference device. Now here I marked the Apple Watch 8 in red. And as you can see, the Watch 8 has the best score out of any of the watches I've tested over the last years. We can see that even more clearly if we zoom in and get rid of some of the worst performing watches. The Watch 8 has the highest score, but is still very close in performance to the other Apple Watches, the old Apple Watch SE, the Apple Watch 6 and the Apple Watch 7. I'm not sure that it's actually performing better. It might just be within the error margins of my measurements. I suspect honestly that this is the case. One surprising thing is that it performed even a bit better than wearing 2 ECG chest straps at the same time. One explanation could be the error margins that you have in any measurement, or the fact that I had to place 1 ECG chest strap in a lower position than recommended, so it wasn't completely ideally positioned. Overall, this means that the Apple Watch Series 8 is doing really well when it comes to heart rate tracking. Next, let's briefly take a look at another easy type of exercise for a watch to track, walking outside, for which I did 2 tests. These are the results for the first walk. Again, in blue-green are the measurements of the chest strap, and in red my Apple Watch. We see more or less a perfect overlap here, just with some small deviations. And we see something similar for the second walk, though there are a few more deviations, as you can see for instance right here and right here. Overall, it's still really good, but these deviations do show that the Apple Watch is not perfect. So this is still looking really good, but the extra movements associated with walking might just interfere a little bit with the measurements taken by the Apple Watch. Next, let's take a look at an even more challenging type of exercise, cycling outside. While cycling outdoors, watches tend to shift a lot more on the wrist, making accurate heart rate readings much more difficult. To see if and how this affected the Apple Watch, I tested it during a total of 8 bike rides. Here we see a similar overview plot to before, but now for biking outside. As you can see, there's still a really good agreement between the Watch 8 and the ECG chest strap, though some of the points are just a little bit further away from the blue line now. The correlation is also just a little bit lower compared to what we saw before for cycling indoors, with the correlation now being 0.98. However, this is still really good. We can see that in even more detail if you look at some of the bike rides themselves. As you can see, the red line, which is representing the Watch 8, overlaps almost perfectly with the ECG chest strap in blue-green. And this is what we see for many of the bike rides, like this one right here, where we see a really good overlap between both the Apple Watch and the chest strap. There were a few rides that showed some moments where the Apple Watch was not able to detect the heart rate, like you can see here for instance, where the Watch 8 did not detect the heart rate for a minute or two. And we see the same thing in the middle of this ride right here, where the Apple Watch was more or less spot on when it did detect the heart rate, but it did for some moments fail to detect the heart rate at all. We can again put this into perspective by looking at many of the watches I've tested over the last years. Similar to before, we use the correlation with the ECG chest strap as the value on the horizontal axis, and the better the agreement, the more to the top right the device is. As you can see, the Apple Watch Series 8, which I marked here in red, is again amongst the best devices when it comes to heart rate tracking. And we can see that even more clearly if we zoom into the best performing watches. The Watch 8 performs about the same again as the Apple Watch Series 7 and the older generation SE. Also, some selected Huawei watches are close in performance for cycling outside. However, so far, these exercises represent easy and medium hard exercises for a watch to track your heart rate. So let's now move on to one of the most difficult exercises for a watch to track, weightlifting. As I've mentioned previously, this makes it much more difficult because of the increased tension on my wrist and on my arm, making it much harder for the watch to get a clean heart rate signal. However, first a quick side note. If you're interested in the latest updates on the wearables I'm testing, I'm planning to start back up with my newsletter and posting more off-the-cuff things on my Instagram and my YouTube Shorts channel. So if you're interested in any of those are linked below. Of course, you would also make me really happy and it would help my efforts if you subscribe to this YouTube channel. But of course, again, this is totally up to you. Now, enough self-promotion. Let's take a look at the performance of the Apple Watch during weightlifting. Here we again see an overview of the accuracy similar to before, but now for weightlifting. The performance of the Watch 8 seems to be similar to the performance it had during cycling outside, and still most points are along the blue line, so this is really good. The correlation is also still really high at 0.98. If we look at the individual training sessions, we can indeed see that the Watch 8 follows along quite nicely with the chest strap. We do see it struggles a bit here in the beginning, where we also see it does seem to miss a few of the heart rate measurements at the peak of my exercise. Each time I do a set of exercises, my heart rate increases, and the Apple Watch in red is generally able to follow along with this, though it doesn't follow along perfectly with the chest strap, which is displayed in blue-green. Still, it looks quite good, as is also true for this other training example. Again, the red line is the Apple Watch 8, which follows along quite well with the blue-green line of the ECG chest strap. We can again put this into perspective by comparing it to many of the other watches I've tested in the past, and we can see those results in this overview right here. Again, the more to the top right, the better the consistency with the ECG chest strap. And as you can see, relative to other watches at least, the Watch 8, which is marked here in red, is doing really well, which we can again see more clearly by zooming in. We see that the Apple Watch Series 8 is amongst the best performing watches, together with the Series 7 and Series 6. So for weightlifting, the Apple Watch Series 8 appears to be a solid choice. So based on this initial testing, I would conclude that the Apple Watch Series 8 is a really good heart rate tracker, like basically all newer Apple Watches. It is one of the few smartwatches that has decent performance during weightlifting, and it also does really well during cardio. Overall, I would therefore give the heart rate tracking 5 out of 5 stars, since Apple Watches are basically my go-to devices for on-the-wrist heart rate tracking. Now, before getting to the sleep test results, I do have to make a remark about a potential small issue of the Strava exports of the Apple Watch. In my last video, I showed you this plot for the heart rate tracking of the Apple Watch Series 8 during cycling. And we saw that during this part of the right here, there was some missing data. Now, to make this plot, I used the Strava export from Apple, since the normal native export I get from Apple has 2 mistakes in the file format since the new watchOS was released that prevents me from loading it. However, I now wrote some custom code to fix this format. And if I load that data, we get this plot right here, so we don't have that missing data right here. So before we saw here there was some missing data, which is not there if I use the export from Apple. Which means the plot looks even a bit better, and we see a better overlap between the Apple Watch Series 8 and the ECG chest strap. I just wanted to share this with you, since it means there might be small deviations if you use Strava to get your Apple heart rate data instead of the native Apple Health. For the nerds out there like me that want to know how to fix the Apple export issue, the XML file you get from Apple Health has a mistake in the header, and the workout statistics declare 2 start dates instead of a start and end date. Okay, enough super nerdy talk, let's get back to the normal level of nerdiness. Let's move on to something that Apple was late to implement, but immediately seems to have become the market leader at: sleep stage tracking. I showed you in a recent video that the new algorithm implemented by Apple outperformed all other watches I tested so far. So let's see if this is also true for the implementation of the Series 8 sleep tracking. I do have a relatively limited test sample set for now, since I could only track my sleep for 3 nights so far. And I actually had to exclude one, the first night, because the watch did not report my sleep. I think this could have potentially been my own fault, since I went to bed after 4 AM and I might have deactivated the sleep mode. Now, like basically all smartwatches, the Watch 8 will track your sleep throughout the night and let you know when it thinks you were in REM sleep, deep sleep, light sleep, and awake. Let's take a look at those results. To check if the Apple Watch Series 8 can detect my sleep stages, I'll compare it to an EEG device called the Dream 2 that can actually measure my brain waves and has been shown to be relatively reliable at sleep stage tracking. Now here I show an overview of the sleep test results. For getting an overall impression of how well the Watch 8 performs, the Dream 2 should likely be good enough. However, the gold standard would be polysomnography, which I would also like to try on the Watch 8 in the future. Now on top are the sleep stages as recorded by the EEG device, and on the left the sleep stages as recorded by the Watch 8. I wore both the EEG device and the Apple Watch to bed for 3 nights, but I only had 2 nights of usable data. And I will see how close the predictions of the Apple Watch are to those of the EEG device. Now each column here sums to 100%, meaning that we can see what percentage of each of the sleep stages according to the Dream 2 was predicted as each sleep stage by the Watch 8. If the 2 devices perfectly agree, all values on the diagonal should be 100%. First of all, we see that 97.5% of what was deep sleep according to the EEG device was also predicted as deep sleep according to the Apple Watch, which is some of the best tracking we've seen for any watch. On the few occasions that deep sleep according to the EEG device was predicted differently by the Apple Watch, it was predicted as light sleep at 2.5%. And we can see that based on the individual nights. On top here we have the sleep stages according to the Dream 2 EEG headband, with the clock time along the horizontal axis and the sleep stages on the vertical axis. On the bottom we have a similar plot, but now for the Apple Watch Series 8. I've highlighted all the EEG recorded deep sleep in purple right here. Now for this night we can indeed see that the deep sleep detected by the EEG headband and the deep sleep detected by the Apple Watch Series 8 basically show the same results. So they have more or less perfect agreement. And this second night shows much of the same results, with a good match between both devices when it comes to deep sleep detection. The Apple Watch did detect some extra very brief deep sleep segments later in the night though, as you can see right here and right here. Light sleep agreement was also really good at about 90%, which is again showing that Apple Watches appear to be really good at sleep stage tracking. And if they did disagree, it could be that the Apple Watch 8 predicted any of the other sleep stages, but mostly as deep sleep and awake time. REM sleep agreement was also quite good, at about 65% agreement with the EEG device. If it was predicted differently, it was mostly predicted as being light sleep, at about 31%. And we can see that clearly based on the individual nights as well. This is a similar plot to before, but now with the REM sleep as measured by the EEG device marked in red. Again, we see a very good agreement, as all of the REM sleep segments detected by the EEG device are also detected by the Apple Watch. It's just the total duration that varies a bit, but not much at all. And we see the same thing for the other night, where we see a good agreement between both devices when it comes to REM sleep tracking. Though again, the last segment shows some disagreement when it comes to duration. This means that we can also see the sleep cycles based on just the data from the Apple Watch Series 8. Now you go through roughly 4 to 6 sleep cycles each night, each one starting with light and deep sleep marked in blue, and each one ending in REM sleep marked in red. As you can see, I likely had 1, 2, 3, 4 complete sleep cycles this night. And we're able to see this based on just the data from the Apple Watch, which is actually something that most watches struggle with, so that's a really good result. Awake detection also agreed very well at about 93% agreement. And any disagreement was with light sleep, which makes sense as light sleep is the closest sleep stage to being awake. In general, the Apple Watch Series 8 does tend to detect the awake moments that the EEG device also detected, which are marked here in green. But it generally tends to detect some more awake moments as well, as you can see here, for instance, in the middle of the night and also right here. And we see the same thing for this second example night right here, where the EEG device detected no significant awake moments, whereas the Apple Watch did detect several really short awakenings. Now I should note here that the Apple Watch might be intentionally set to also detect the really short awake moments, whereas the Dream 2 EEG headband might be set to ignore these. To put these results into context, we can compare the performance of the Apple Watch Series 8 to that of 38 other watches I've tested in the past. This graph shows an overview of the agreement of different watches with the EEG device. Along the horizontal axis, we have the average agreement over the 4 individual sleep stages, and on the vertical axis, we have the agreement of the worst sleep stage. Now, the better the agreement, the more to the top right a device is. And as you can see, the device with the best agreement so far was the Apple Watch Series 7, which I tested for 18 nights. Other good devices include different Fitbits, Whoop straps, and the Withings Sleep Analyzer. If we now plot the Apple Watch Series 8 in the same plot, which is marked here in red, we see that this is again amongst the best agreeing watches. Of course, this is just based on 2 nights, so there will be a significant error margin. However, the fact that it's so close in results to the Series 7 indicates that the results are consistently good between Apple Watches. And we can confirm that by also plotting the results for the new 2022 Apple Watch SE in the same plot, for which I'm actually now making a separate complete video. As you can see, it's also in the same region of performance, really confirming the quality of Apple Watches when it comes to sleep stage tracking. Overall, the sleep stage tracking of the Apple Watch Series 8 seems to be really good, and I suspect it does about as well as all of the other Apple Watches. Therefore, overall, I'd also give the sleep stage tracking of the Apple Watch Series 8 5 out of 5 stars. Now, one of the new features the Apple Watch Series 8 implemented is that it tracks your skin temperature throughout the night. I already discussed this in my last video, but now that I had some more hands-on experience, I want to make 3 new remarks. First of all, the data that is accessible to me only has a single value for the whole night, so it does not seem that Apple stores the changes of temperature throughout the night. Second, many people asked in the comments if I think that the sleep stage tracking will be better on the Series 8 because of this new sensor. Now, I don't think that's the case for 2 reasons. First of all, that would mean that Apple would have to implement 2 different algorithms for different models, which would be a lot of extra work and potentially also make them less robust. And 2, the sleep tracking on the new Apple Watch SE also appears to be quite good, and that does not have the new temperature sensor, but more on that in a different video. One more thing I wanted to mention is that you officially cannot see your wrist temperature during the first 5 nights, since the Apple Watch still needs to measure your baseline. However, if you want, you can already see your skin temperature after the first night by creating an export of your Apple Health data and then searching the file for something called sleep wrist temperature. Okay, enough about the temperature. Let's now move on to another important feature of the Apple Watch Series 8, the location or GPS tracking. To test that, I tracked my route during 7 bike rides while I was cycling to and from work. And I wanted to test 2 things. 1, how long does it take for the watch to get a GPS signal? And 2, how well the GPS signals overlap when cycling the same route several times. I should mention that I put my phone in flight mode and turned off Bluetooth to make sure that the Apple Watch could not piggyback on my phone's signal and would have to completely rely on its own sensors. Those results are displayed here for 4 times I cycled to work. Now, I started the activity the moment I was ready to leave, and I did not provide the watch with any extra time to acquire the signal. The green markers indicate those moments it connected to GPS signals, and as you can see, it connected almost instantly in all of the cases, which is really good. If we now look at the consistency between the signals, this is also really good. The signals mostly overlap really well and they're very close together most of the time, though sometimes there's some small deviation. However, you can also see here, for instance, that they overlap almost perfectly. And this is true for most of my journey, where the overlap is actually very, very good. I would say that only near the end here do we see some deviation, though this is not that bad. And also right here do we see a deviation, and here there's a more significant deviation. But overall, this is not looking too bad at all. And for cycling back from work, we see more or less the same thing. The signal is acquired almost instantly, as you can see here, and once it has the signal, it overlaps really well. Now overall, I would say it looks pretty good, though there are some moments with a bit of deviation. We see one example right here, for instance, but also here the lines deviate a bit, and especially here do we see some more deviation. However, most of the time the signals are pretty consistent, as you can see right here, for instance. Overall, I'm happy with the GPS tracking performance of the Watch 8. It locks onto my signal really fast and tracks my routes quite consistently. Therefore, overall, I'd give the GPS tracking between 4 and 4.5 out of 5 stars. Though I still have to quantify it, the quality seems similar to what we've seen for some of the better Garmin watches. Next, let's take a look at a feature of the watch that became more important during the COVID pandemic, namely measuring your oxygen saturation, or in other words, SpO2. To test the oxygen saturation measurements, I wanted to see if the Watch 8 ever detects a low oxygen saturation when it's not supposed to. And I did this by taking measurements with the watch when I knew that my SpO2 was at normal levels. Now, I also discussed this in the last video, but I now more than doubled the data to a total of more than 80 measurements. I systematically swapped the watch between both of my wrists, and this way I hope to get a good representation of the measurements it can take. At the same time, I also recorded my oxygen saturation with a dedicated finger pulse oximeter. Now, at ground level, my oxygen saturation should be in my normal range, which is generally between 97 and 100% and should not fall below roughly 95%. However, when the effective oxygen concentration is much lower, as it is for instance in a low air pressure environment, my oxygen saturation can drop below 90%. The same can happen for instance when you have certain medical conditions like sleep apnea or a respiratory infection. Now here you can see the measurements I took at ground level. On the left are all the measurements taken with the Watch 8, and on the right the matching measurements taken with the finger pulse oximeter. On the vertical axis are the SpO2 values, with each dot indicating a single measurement. As you can see, the Watch 8 on the left generally recorded lower SpO2 values than the finger pulse oximeter on the right. In general, the spread of values is much larger for the Apple Watch Series 8 than for the finger pulse oximeter. We can see that even more clearly if we display these results as a histogram. In this case, the SpO2 values are along the horizontal axis, and the larger the bar, the more often this value was recorded. As you can see, the Apple Watch Series 8, which is displayed in red, mostly recorded lower values than the finger pulse oximeter, which is displayed in blue-green, and sometimes it even recorded values of 94% or lower, which is much lower than what I would normally experience at ground level. However, it also seems that the new measurements I took with the Apple Watch compared to those in my previous video are more often in the normal range, making it appear a bit better than it did in my last testing. So this is looking okay, though definitely not great. Overall, based on the testing I've done so far, I'd give the SpO2 measurements of the Apple Watch Series 8 either 3 or 3.5 out of 5 stars. Now the next thing I tested on the Apple Watch 8 is the step counting accuracy. To test the step counting accuracy, I went out and took exactly 8,000 steps with the Apple Watch Series 8. Now, I do not like counting 8,000 steps in my head, which is why I counted each step manually using this tally counter. Let's take a look at those results. Here you can see the results for the first 4,000 steps, where I wore the Apple Watch Series 8 on my left arm. Along the horizontal axis we have the time, and the total number of steps counted by the Apple Watch is on the vertical axis. The red line represents the actual steps counted by the watch, and the blue vertical lines indicate the moments that it should have counted 1,000 more steps. So the first blue line indicates where it should have counted 1,000 steps, the second 2,000, 3,000 and so on. As you can see, the Apple Watch was pretty consistent and it generally counted very close to the steps it should have counted, which is good, though it might have just counted a few steps too little near the end. But as you can see, it's still really close to the 4,000 steps it should have counted. I wore the new 2022 Apple Watch SE at the same time, but on the other wrist, which is displayed here in the same plot but now in blue-green. We actually see that both watches performed more or less similarly, both consistently counting more or less the correct number of steps. I actually repeated this test, but now switching the watches to the opposite wrists and also changing that in the settings. As you can see, the watch was again pretty close to the actual number of steps it should have counted, though there were some deviations. Also be aware that I took a short break in walking here near the end, which is why this final segment looks a bit longer. Overall, the Watch 8 did pretty well, though near the end it counted a few steps too many. Again, if we display the new 2022 Apple Watch SE in blue-green, we see that this performed more or less the same as the Apple Watch 8. I would say that both did quite well, though the SE might have done slightly better. So this is looking quite good. However, the next question is if the Apple Watch Series 8 ever counts steps when it's not supposed to, for instance when doing activities that do not involve walking. Those results are displayed here for 4 activities on the vertical axis, so that's walking, weightlifting, spinning and biking. On the horizontal axis are the number of steps per minute the Apple Watch counted for each of these activities. Now ideally it would count 0 steps per minute during all of the activities except for walking of course, which should give a significant number of steps per minute. As you can see, when I was walking, it counted about 80 to 90 steps per minute, which is a normal walking pace. Now when cycling outside, which you see here in blue, it actually counted close to 0 steps per minute most of the time, which is really good. Interestingly though, while weightlifting, which is purple here, and while spinning, which is displayed here in green, it did count some steps. I would say roughly between 10 and 20 steps per minute. Though this is much less than while walking, it is still surprising it counted quite some steps during these static exercises. So overall, the step counting performance of the Apple Watch Series 8 seems to be quite good. When you're walking, it counts roughly the correct number of steps. However, it does sometimes count some steps when it's not supposed to, for instance while cycling indoors or weightlifting. Therefore, overall, I'd give the step counting accuracy 4 out of 5 stars. Now, looking at the Series 8 Apple Watch as a whole, I'm quite happy with its performance. It has some of the best heart rate tracking and sleep tracking out of all of the devices I've tested. And in my cycling test, it also had pretty reliable GPS tracking. The step counting was quite good, and the only thing that was not great were the oxygen saturation measurements. I would say that the main downside of this watch is the relatively short battery life of the Apple Watch. You need to be really consistent with your charging schedule and find some time each morning or evening to top off that charge. However, as long as you're willing to do that and you own an iPhone, the Apple Watch is one of the best sports and health trackers out there. The main thing that is still missing with regards to health tracking is providing advice based on the health metrics it takes. Still, overall, I'd give the Apple Watch Series 8 4.5 out of 5 stars. Now, if you want to buy the Apple Watch, another device, or anything at all on Amazon for that matter, even something as small as toilet paper, and at the same time support the channel, there are different affiliate links in the description below that do not cost you any extra, and some even provide a discount. By the way, you might want to actually stick with Android and still have good heart rate tracking. In that case, some Huawei watches are actually quite good, as I discussed in these videos right here. For sleep tracking, Fitbit devices are much cheaper and also perform quite well, as you can see in this video right here. Now, I hope that this video provided you with some value. Thank you so much for watching and catch you in the next video.